Hey, I'm Alex from Board Game Co, and today we are starting a new video series on the channel, the games being added to my collection. Ever since I started this channel, since the very beginning, I've done a video series of the games leaving my collection. It's been a consistent monthly series I do every single, well, month, I guess. Although the games leaving the collection every single month is usually a combination of two things. It's a combination of the games that are actually leaving the collection, looking around the shelves, trying to decide what will and won't get played, and those games leave. But it's also the games that I tried and not really leaving, they just didn't get added. So new games, I tried it, played a few times, reviewed it, or maybe it's not a review copy, but for whatever reason, it got played and it never even got added. That's what the video series is, which leaves a noticeable gap of the games being added to the collection. We have the games that didn't make it, the games that are leaving, and now we're going to have the games that are being added. Now, I am curious, and I do welcome your feedback as to whether you think this should be bundled with the other video as one video every single month. For the next few months, I'm probably going to do it separate as I try to get a feel for how I like it myself, but I do welcome your feedback, and it likely will guide in what format this continues to be part of the conversation. Now, I will say, if you do watch my other videos, if you watch my reviews, my conversations, my top 10 lists, very often you might have a sense of which games are currently on my radar as games that I really enjoyed and are likely being added. The goal of this is to kind of, well, twofold. The goal is to round up the straight up having, here's a list of what's being added with whatever notes are present. Some things might get notes like, hey, it's being added for right now, but I'm not sure where it'll settle, and obviously you'll see it in the games leaving the collection if it decides to go away, if I decide it goes away. And the other aspect is it forces me to really critically examine which games I want to actually add. No more wishy-washy, just kind of let's see how things pan out, but I have to kind of really decide, do I think this will get table time or not, and how do I think that will iterate or develop over the next, well, over continuing to play it. To that end, some general notes about how the video series are structured. Games leaving the collection is always based on where I do it at the time. What games are not being added and are leaving based on where I film it. So for example, games leaving the collection for May is usually based on the things that I've played mostly in April and or in May up until when I filmed that video. Versus games added to the collection is going to specifically always be done for the month before. So when I say games added to the collection May, what I'm referring to is the games that got a first play from me in April. Whether they are pre-orders, and that's why I don't have them on the table in front of me, meaning whether they are prototypes of crowdfunding campaigns, things that don't exist yet, and they may not be on the table here, or whether they are actual physical retail games, anything I played for the first time in the month before is going to be in the video series for games being added to collection in May, with the various notes and all that. And I will say, very often you might get little spoilers to reviews that haven't actually gone up yet, because I'm going to tell you my thoughts based on where they are now, and that might be a precursor to any reviews you get to see. Some of these I've definitely filmed, well, one of these on the table I've filmed a review for, and some of the other ones we'll talk about, because there's more than 4 games we're talking about today. Now, before we start the actual video, and I know we're 2 minutes into before we start the actual video, but before we start the video, just a small recap, because one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of keep track of how my collection size is changing through this video series. You see, this month's video of games leaving the collection for May had, I believe it was 14 games that were leaving. But 14 games is a bit of a cheat because really it was 9 games that weren't being added and then 5 games that were leaving. The 5 games that were leaving my collection were Gollum, Ark Nova, we had Too Many Cooks, we had Magic Rabbit, and Crazy Race. That's 5 games that were in my collection. They'd been sitting around for anywhere from 6 months to 7 years, and they were leaving my collection, which means my collection's at -5. But today, I'm adding 7, which puts me at +2. I'm basically up 2 games, because that's going to be the interesting thing for me, tracking my own collection movements about things that get added, things that get taken away, and then the things that just never really made their way in. And to that end, we're going to talk about these in order of what I like the least to most as I go through this. We have 7 games to go through over here, starting off with Kids Chronicles, The Old Oak Prophecy. This one is a sort of cheat, although there's another one over here on this list as well, because this is a game that's designed to be played and then you're done with, and speaking for myself, at least based on the original Quest for the Moonstones, it's a game I'm going to play and then be done with, meaning it is being added right now. This is a game that I've already played a few times with my kids. I'll be continuing the adventure. I believe there's 5 in the 5, well, plus the tutorial, so maybe there's 6 total adventures. I think I've done 3 so far in this box, and it's a game that I'm going to finish playing through with my kids, and then you will see it in games leaving the collection. It's not a game I'm going to keep around forever, especially with Lucky Duck. If they continue to put out more of these, I will continue to try these. These are basically Chronicles of Crime for kids. That's the idea of this series. It has that QR code scanning, you're looking at your phone, you're trying to check where you are, so the kids are able to turn the phone, navigate, and see various parts of the terrain, and say, oh, I saw a little, like, bundle of eggs, and I see a stick, and I see that person. But it's basically an exploration where you're going along, you're encountering various people. How you talk to those people and engage with them is going to inform your next encounter. You'll be going to the wolf in the woods over there, and then you'll be going to the stream and see the water there, and then go back to the wolf where you can now fill up a flask, and all these things will be happening as far as a sequential series of events in which you are engaging with various characters. It's kind of a detective mystery story, but really for me it's almost a little bit of a, not even choose your own adventure, it's just a narrative adventure. That's all it is. It's a video game turned into a board game to a certain extent. My kids enjoy it. It's a lighter game for sure. It's not one I would ever dive into a second time, but it's one that I'm happy to finish and move on from. But again, as a game that I do plan on finishing, I felt it deserved to be in this video. Coming up at number 2, we have Expressions. And Expressions, and these are all ranked kind of, well, I don't know how I'm ranking this, because I was going to say I ranked in order of what I think is most likely to stick around versus not, but perhaps not. Maybe it's just in terms of what I enjoyed the most or not, because again, Light in the Mist is a complicated one. We'll get to that soon. Anyways, Expressions. Expressions over here is one that I filmed a review for it. I don't know if the review has gone up yet, but we'll see when the things go up. But Expressions is a kind of read each other's, well, not expressions, the expressions are on the cards. There's no actual expressions in the game. But it's kind of like The Crew. The general idea of the game, let's go ahead and see if I can show you, I don't know if I can show you much over here, you won't be able to see much, let's zoom in a bit more over here. But each card kind of has 4 different sides, and those sides kind of determine whether you're telling people whether that's the only card you have in your hand, the highest card of that color, the lowest card of that color, or whether you have other numbers of that type in your hand. And you're trying to basically take turns making guesses about what is in each other's player's hands. So you're going to be trying to figure out, do you have a red 7? And if you're right, it helps in your good harmony pile, whereas if you're wrong, you're going to be adding cards to your, I can't remember what it's called, agony pile. I think it's harmony and agony if I'm not mistaken. But the general idea is trying to figure out the most efficient clues to give, where you realize that every turn is either a guess or a clue, so you're trying to be as efficient as possible with the most beneficial clues as well as cards you can discard that give your teammates as much information as possible. I enjoy it for sure. Very solid game. It does fall into the vein of The Crew in terms of the feeling I get from playing it, with the downside being that it's less variable than that game, which is why it is one that's definitely being added for now. I think it can stick around for a while. I don't know if it's a forever game. I think it's the kind of game that, a year from now, 6 months from now, 3 years from now, I don't know when, it is the kind of game that I might be like, whenever I'm looking around my collection and trying to think to myself, what can I get rid of today? This is the kind of game I could see being on that list, because I always am. Again, I'm adding 7 games today, which means some games have to leave too. And I'm always trying to be trying to keep my collection size manageable. And that means actively pursuing games to get rid of. And so I could see myself looking at the shelf one day and saying, you know what? I like Expressions, but I've played it enough, and it's not as variable as The Crew, so maybe it goes. I don't know when that happens, but it is something that is likely to happen at some point. Next up on the table over here, we have Spectral, which I do have somewhere. I don't know where the box is. Another one that I filmed a review for, and I don't know when the review is going up. But Spectral is a game from, from Bitewing Games that gives you a very interesting deduction experience. It basically forces you to combine a degree of area control and bumping people out with like kind of worker placement bumping effectively, combined with deduction, where you're trying to figure out what are the best and worst places to go on the board as you figure out where the gems and curses are. The combination of deduction, which is reasonable enough, the base game starts off to be fairly easy. There are some extra cards you can add in. If you have the crowdfunding, the Kickstarter version of the game, there's another little extra mini expansion as well. So it gives you some degree of variety to the experience. It's also a very deluxe game if you have the deluxe game. And then past that, it adds that to a degree of tactical area control and bumping workers out that really forces you to kind of figure out how to approach this deduction game, where you're always operating with some information, but how much and where are you willing to take those extra chances on a 25% chance, on a 50% chance, gives you a lot to work with. I really enjoy Spectral. For me, it falls into the vein of, I think Tiwanuku is going to be the other game that I enjoy most in the deduction range. There's also Core of Discovery, that's a recent one. I'm looking forward to when that shows up. I generally like deduction, but I also am always comparing deduction games against each other to figure out which ones I like best. I think Spectral is easy enough to play, short enough, easy enough to teach, that it's one that for right now, I think it's kind of one that will likely stick around. Like, that's an easy game to teach. It's an easy game. Like, one of the things I do think about, especially when you're talking about a large collection, is how easy it is to remember and teach a game. Is this a game where if I don't play it for a year, can I pull it off the shelf and teach it in 2 minutes, or do I need 20 minutes to get up to speed? That does change the likelihood of a game to get tabled, and it does change my own perception of, is it worth holding on to? Spectral is a game that comes in at 45 minutes. I think I could be up to speed, but I cannot play the game for 2 years, and I could probably teach it in 5 minutes, or be ready to teach it in 5 minutes. It's that easy to dive into. Bitewing does a great job with the rules. That gives it a good reason to stick around for a bit. Similar to Expressions, I don't know if it's a forever game. Time will tell on that one, but for right now, it's definitely one that I want to add. Next up, we have Trickerion. Trickerion is arguably one of the best experiences I've had from the 7 games I'm adding today, but it's also one of the longest ones. Going to what I just said about Spectral and Bitewing games, Trickerion almost has the opposite problem. It is an excellent game. It's an absolutely excellent game. The review will come at some point. I need more plays of the game before I'm willing to review it, but the review will come at some point. But know that right now, I think it's absolutely amazing. But the downsides of it is it's very long per player. Playing a 3 or 4 player game is going to take up your entire evening. Playing a 2 player game is going to be a big chunk or the majority of your game night. And so this is a game that definitely requires a commitment to. It requires a lot of teach. There's a ton of expansions and modules as well, which will only add to the teach. To me, this is one of those games that unless I'm playing with the same group again and again, I basically will almost always return to the base game because I always have to get people up to speed on what the game is like. And then it's very thinky too. It's definitely a lot of thinking and processing and trying to optimize your hand and the choices as you try to figure out where to place your workers and how to get those actions and combine various tricks. It's a very, very thinky game that's also very long. So a lot of brain power, a lot of rules. It's a game that if I don't play on a regular basis, getting up to speed in Trickerion is not going to be a small amount of work. So there's a lot of things going for it in terms of how great a game it can be, but a lot of things going against it in terms of, is this a game ultimately that I'm going to pull off my shelf? I mentioned getting rid of Golem. Golem is a game I love, but ultimately when it comes to heavy Euros like that, they really have to stand out for me. And Golem, as much as I do appreciate both the theme and the gameplay, there are other heavy Euros that feel similar that I get more from. Trickerion's biggest concern in terms of the longevity of my collection is going to come down to, is it a game I am actively playing, and is it a game that's worth the sheer amount of time it takes to play it? Those things are still things I'm deciding as I go through it. For right now, though, it's an easy add to my collection because it's that good. Whether how things hold out over time, that's a different conversation, and we'll see. And you'll also get more information in a review when I get more plays under my belt and can further refine my thoughts on the game. From there, we have The Light in the Mist, which is a weird one because The Light in the Mist is a game that's ideally meant to be played through once and then you're done. This is a puzzle game, but it's also beautifully produced. This is coming to you from, from Post Curious. They make these beautifully produced puzzle games, which is why for me, Kids Chronicles is an easy play once and move on from. The Light in the Mist, I'll probably hold on to. This game is small enough, cute enough, it's going to represent the memories I've had playing it, and it's a game I can lend out to somebody else and give them the same experience. So not only that, I could pull out a single card. That's the nice thing with The Light in the Mist. It's basically these 20 tarot cards that all give you an isolated puzzle. So you have these puzzles to operate, and I can easily, just for fun, walk through a puzzle with somebody else, being like, hey, here's a card, here's the tarot, here's the few cards to go with the tarot, try to figure this out. And then I can kind of coach or guide them through it, giving them a sense of that whether this is a game that they would enjoy or not. So for me, I don't think The Light in the Mist actually leaves my collection even when I'm done with it, but I might be wrong. Maybe I'll change my mind one day about that. And I'm not done with it yet. I'm like 5-6 puzzles into it so far out of those 20 puzzles. It's one of those things you can pull out, do 2 or 3 puzzles, put it away, or do 1 puzzle and put it away. It's that kind of experience. I enjoy it a lot so far. Again, I'll have a review for you at some point. Maybe when I finish it, maybe I'm like 10 puzzles in or whatnot. I'll have a review for you at some point, giving my thoughts on the game. For right now, I definitely enjoy it. I think Post Curious does fantastic escape room style puzzle experiences, and this is one that weirdly enough, I'm not sure if it will leave even when I'm done with it. Maybe eventually, but I don't know. I think it's the kind of experience I want to share and gift to others, or lend to others, and then be able to get it back and lend it to the next person. So that's why I'm on The Light in the Mist. Then we have next up is going to be number 6 on the list, which is another one I don't have on the table. In fact, the last 2 I don't have on the table. But the number 6 is going to be God of War, the board game. God of War, the board game, had a chance to play this several times when they had the crowdfunding campaign, and I overall really enjoyed the tactical back and forth within the experience. Now, this is another CMON style game. You're rolling dice, you're trying... Wait, are you rolling dice? No, you're playing cards. There's no dice rolling. There's dice rolling. I can't remember if there's dice rolling. Why can't I remember if there's dice rolling? I'm trying to remember... There is dice rolling when you kill an enemy. That's what it is. There are dice. The dice are not in combat, though. You're drawing cards, you're using those cards to power up attacks, you're trying to level up your characters, and meanwhile you're trying to figure out how to take down this big bad who is also going to get stronger in the game. And so you're operating with these different scenarios of taking down a combination of unique forces and a unique monster and a unique scenario, all combining together while you control your characters, Atreides and Kratos and Atreides in the game, Kratos and Atreus? I can't remember exactly the name, but either way, you're controlling the characters from the God of War video game. They have a bunch of expansions, a whole ton of content for the game to mix up the experience regarding the boss you're fighting, the enemies you're fighting, and the scenario you're fighting in. Now, for me, God of War the board game, I definitely really enjoyed the game. The one concern I have around it, as far as is it a forever game, is going to be Cthulhu Death May Die. I think Cthulhu Death May Die is going with the same general principle of God of War, but it's a better experience. For me, it's just a better experience in terms of the character variety, in terms of the boss variety, how the bosses operate, in terms of how different the scenarios feel when you combine a scenario and a boss and the enemies, and how vastly different that is compared to God of War, which feels like it's not as different while still being enjoyable. Now, God of War does have one thing that stands out nicely, which is the whole aspect of the synergy, where both characters have to do damage to the enemy units. That's going to give it an extra reason to try to think through the tactical puzzle that creates. So it does have something going for it other than just being a worse Cthulhu Death May Die, but at the same time, that is the one thing that makes me hesitate. Is God of War a game that I enjoy and play through a bunch and then move on from, or is it a game that sits around for years because I enjoy that kind of gameplay enough? My instinct is it's going to be the latter. I think it is a game that will stick around for a while, but that's an instinct based on how much I enjoyed playing through the game, and not an instinct based on the practical reality of having games on my shelf, and sometimes games I want to play. I wake up one day, realize it's been 3 years since I played it, and realize that I'm always going to pick something else over it. So there is a threat on God of War, definitely not a guaranteed forever game, but a game that I enjoy enough, and I wonder whether Cthulhu Death May Die will always be the game I pick over it after some initial plays. Like, once it shows up, I'm going to dive into it a few times, it's easy enough to table, I know how to play, all those barriers are gone. But then once I got a few games into my belt, I don't know whether it's one I'm constantly pulling out, or whether I'm choosing other games instead. So we'll see how that lasts. And then lastly, we have Ironwood. Ironwood from Mind Clash Games. They got 2 this month. Ironwood is one that I definitely very much enjoyed. It feels like 2-player root in terms of the feeling of what the game is doing, while being easier to table, and also having solo modes that, while I did enjoy the solo modes, I played through both solo modes of the 2 different sides, because there's 2 unique solo modes to the 2 asymmetric factions. But I definitely enjoy it more as a 2-player experience. Following the automa is not that difficult, but I'd rather play against another human and try to tactically outmaneuver them in the experience, although I think it is one that solo players will definitely enjoy. For myself, I tend to enjoy solo games, but it's not my main focus, and I usually prefer games that are made to play solo or cooperatively as opposed to competitive games that have autonomas. That's usually my preference. That said, I still enjoyed the autonomas, I still enjoyed the solo mode, didn't feel it too overwhelming. But Ironwood is going to be 2-player asymmetric game of the... It's Ironwood because it's the something wood and the iron something. I can't remember the name of the 2 factions. There's 2 factions, wood and iron basically. And you're trying to go with their different ways that they win the game. The Iron's trying to construct these 3 forges or whatnot, foundries, forges on the map, and the Ironwood, or the Wood faction, I can't remember the name of the factions, the Wood faction is effectively trying to get 3 visions out of the forest. They're operating differently with a lot of shared rules so that you can teach both sides of the game and then teach the specific nuances of how each one operates. I thought it was really well balanced, gave a ton of variability from the cards you're playing as, a lot of variability just in the in-baked playing against another player as they tactically play differently and how they approach the game. I've had games that were very fascinating as far as just completely depleting the map of units, and usually what I found, at least so far, like limited plays, but I found so far is that favors the Wood faction, where once you don't have enough of the Iron faction on the table, the Wood faction can usually escape with their visions more easily. So if both sides are depleted, that favors the Wood faction. But it plays differently depending on what strategies you're taking, how you're trying to focus, which cards you're going through, how much you're focusing on combat versus building up, how much you're letting somebody get away with something so you can focus on building up your units better versus how much you need to crush them right now. Very tactical game, really enjoyed it so far. Again, playing it both 2-player and both solo modes. Thought it was an excellent experience for Mind Clash Games. And the thing it has over Trickerion, because I think Trickerion is a better experience, to be clear. I think Trickerion is probably a better game in terms of the sheer enjoyment of the individual game. But Ironwood is easier to table in terms of the length of the game, in terms of the solo mode, and in terms of the fact that it thrives with 2 as opposed to Trickerion. I haven't yet played with 2, but instinctively I think 2 would not be the best player count, but it might be a player count I'm willing to settle on for the sake of faster playtime. And then as well as the fact that Ironwood is going to be easier to remember and teach and get up to speed as opposed to Trickerion. So I think Trickerion is a better game, and I think Ironwood has a better chance of staying a longer time in my collection. And that's what we have over here. These are the 7 games that are being added to my collection, which again, with 5 games leaving my collection this month, that represents a +2 to my collection size, and I'm going to track that stat over the next who knows how long, and see where we end up after a year as far as is my collection continuing to grow, or is it managing to remain somewhat stable. In any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this new series, and as always, I hope you have a good one.